"Don't drink it," says the little girl to the CEO's paralyzed son. The secret he learns changes life. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and type Amen in the comments. A beautiful piece of good news may come your way very soon. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. The Secret That Changed Everything Introduction. When a mysterious 6-year-old girl approaches a powerful CEO's disabled son with shocking words that will shatter everything he believed about his child's condition, a family's destiny transforms forever. What medical secret was hidden in plain sight? Like and comment below. This story will leave you speechless. 01. The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the hospital parking garage as 6-year-old Madison Chen clutched her mother's hand tighter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars that stretched endlessly through the underground structure. Nurse Sarah Chen was finishing another grueling 12-hour shift at Seattle Children's Hospital, her navy blue scrub still bearing the weight of countless lives she'd touched that day. Madison could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her mother's face, the way her shoulders sagged slightly, how her usually bright eyes had dulled to a tired gray, and the slow, careful way she moved as if each step required conscious effort. At 6 years old, Madison was unusually perceptive about such things, a trait that came from spending countless hours observing the adult world around her. "Mama, can we get ice cream?" Madison asked, her bright blue eyes sparkling with hope despite the exhaustion she could see etched across her mother's face. Her small voice echoed slightly in the cavernous parking structure, competing with the distant sound of car engines and elevator doors. Sarah looked down at her daughter and felt her heart clench with guilt. Madison had been so patient today, sitting quietly in the family waiting room while Sarah handled one crisis after another. A 3-year-old with pneumonia, twins recovering from surgery, and an emergency that had required all hands on deck for nearly 2 hours. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of comforting patients and their families. "We need to get home and rest. You have school tomorrow and Mama has another early shift." Madison nodded solemnly, understanding in the way that children of single parents learn to understand early. She knew her mother worked long hours to pay for their small apartment, her school supplies, and the little extras that made their life together special. She'd never complained about the afternoons spent in hospital waiting rooms or the evenings when her mother fell asleep on the couch still wearing her work clothes. As they walked toward their modest sedan, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that Sarah kept meticulously maintained despite its age, Madison's attention was drawn to a sleek black Mercedes parked near the elevator. The car looked like something from a movie, its paint so perfect it reflected the parking garage lights like a mirror. A man in an expensive charcoal gray suit was carefully lifting a small boy from the passenger seat, his movements precise and practiced. The man was tall and imposing, with silver threading through his dark hair despite appearing to be in his early 40s. His suit looked like it cost more than Sarah made in a month, and his leather shoes clicked authoritatively against the concrete floor. Madison watched, fascinated, as the man positioned a pair of child-sized crutches under the boy's arms with the kind of careful precision that spoke of years of practice. The crutches were clearly expensive, lightweight aluminum with padded grips and adjustable height settings, but they seemed enormous compared to the small child using them. The boy couldn't have been older than 5, with sandy blonde hair that caught the fluorescent lighting and enormous hazel eyes that held a mixture of resignation and quiet sadness. He wore clothes that Madison immediately recognized as expensive, a navy blue sweater that looked impossibly soft, khaki pants with a perfect crease, and small leather shoes that probably cost more than her mother's entire work wardrobe. Madison watched as the little boy struggled to maintain his balance, his thin arms working hard to support his weight on the crutches. His father's strong, manicured hands hovered protectively nearby, ready to steady him at the first sign of trouble. "Daddy, I dropped my juice box," the boy said, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and resignation that seemed far too mature for his age. The juice box had rolled several feet away, its blue liquid sloshing inside the clear container. The man, clearly someone accustomed to immediate solutions to any problem, immediately bent to retrieve the fallen drink. His movements were swift and efficient, but Madison noticed something else in his expression as he looked at his son. Worry. Deep, consuming worry that reminded her of the faces she'd seen countless times in the hospital corridors when parents received difficult news about their children. "Careful, Tyler," the man said gently, his voice carrying the weight of authority she'd heard her mother describe when talking about the important doctors who made rounds. "We don't want you to fall. Remember what Dr. Hamilton said about being extra cautious." Madison's mother tugged her hand, urging her toward their car. "Come on, honey. We need to get going. I still need to stop by the grocery store, and you need to finish your homework before bedtime." But something made the little girl pause. She'd spent countless hours in these hospital halls observing, listening, learning. Her mother often brought her to work when childcare fell through, which happened more often than Sarah liked to admit on a nurse's salary. And Madison had developed an unusual awareness of medical situations that most children her age couldn't comprehend. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of pain in children's faces, could identify different types of medical equipment from across a room, and had absorbed an impressive vocabulary of medical terms simply by listening to the conversations that flowed around her. Other children her age might not notice the difference between a wheelchair and a walker, but Madison could spot the distinctions immediately. As Tyler raised the juice box to his lips with hands that seemed to tremble slightly from the effort of balancing on his crutches, Madison's breath caught in her throat. The liquid inside was a distinctive pale blue color, the same unusual shade she'd seen countless times in the medication preparation room when she'd peek through the crack in the door during her mother's shifts. "Madison, come on," her mother called softly, but the little girl was frozen in place, her mind racing through memories and connections that most adults would have missed. She remembered watching the pharmacy technicians measure out liquid medications, remembered the way certain drugs had that particular blue tint, remembered conversations she'd overheard about the importance of proper medication administration. Most importantly, she remembered a conversation from 3 days ago that had troubled her ever since. 3 days earlier, Madison had been hiding in the supply closet near the pharmacy, playing quietly with her coloring book while her mother handled an emergency in the intensive care unit. The supply closet was one of her favorite hiding spots, quiet, filled with the comforting smell of clean linens, and positioned perfectly to observe the bustling activity of the hospital without being noticed. She'd been carefully coloring within the lines of a butterfly picture when 2 doctors had stopped directly outside the closet door, their voices low but urgent enough to capture her attention. "The paralysis medication has been switched again," one doctor had whispered, his voice tight with frustration. "Someone's been deliberately administering muscle relaxants instead of the prescribed vitamins. This is the 3rd case we've identified, and I'm starting to think it's not accidental." Madison had recognized the voice as belonging to Dr. Stevens, a kind woman who always smiled at her when they passed in the hallways. "Doctor." Stevens had dark curly hair and wore glasses that made her look like the smart teacher in Madison's favorite books. "How long has this been going on?" the other doctor had asked. This voice belonged to Dr. Rodriguez, not the police officer Rodriguez, but a tall man with a beard who worked in the children's wing. "Possibly years, Doctor," Stevens had replied, and Madison could hear papers rustling as if they were reviewing files. "The poor kid doesn't even know his legs work properly. The muscle relaxants have been keeping him essentially paralyzed, but it's so gradual and consistent that everyone assumes it's his actual medical condition. Do we have any idea who's doing this? This isn't just medical malpractice, this is deliberate assault on a child. That's what makes it so disturbing. Someone with medical knowledge and access to pharmaceuticals is specifically targeting this family. The prescriptions look legitimate, the paperwork is perfect, but the actual medication is completely wrong." Madison had memorized every word of that conversation, the way children do when they sense something monumentally important is happening around them. She'd understood that somewhere in the hospital, a little boy was being given medicine that was hurting him instead of helping him, and that the grown-ups who were supposed to protect him didn't know what was happening. Now, watching Tyler drink that distinctive blue liquid, every alarm bell in her 6-year-old mind was screaming with recognition. Without thinking, Madison broke free from her mother's grasp and ran toward the Mercedes, her small sneakers slapping against the concrete floor of the parking garage. "Don't drink that!" she shouted, her small voice echoing through the cavernous space and drawing startled looks from other families heading to their cars. Both Tyler and his father turned in surprise. the man's piercing gray eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the small girl running toward them. Behind her, Sarah was following quickly, her face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "I'm so sorry," Sarah began, reaching for Madison's hand, but her daughter pulled away with a determination that surprised everyone present. "Don't drink that medicine," Madison repeated, looking directly at Tyler with the intensity that only children possess when they know something is desperately wrong. Her voice was clear and urgent, cutting through the ambient noise of the parking garage. "I'm going to call 911. Your life is about to change." The man, Marcus Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Industries and one of Seattle's most powerful business leaders, stared down at the child in complete bewilderment. In his 42 years of life, he'd navigated corporate mergers worth billions of dollars, hostile takeovers that made front-page news, and board meetings that determined the fate of thousands of employees. He'd faced down corporate raiders, government regulators, and investigative journalists without flinching. But he'd never encountered anything quite like this moment. A 6-year-old girl with dirt on her sneakers and a Disney princess backpack telling him his son's life was about to change. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, his voice carrying the edge of someone unused to being challenged, especially by a child. His tone was carefully controlled, but Madison could see the confusion and irritation flickering across his features. Madison pulled out a small flip phone her mother had given her for emergencies, an old device that Sarah had programmed with important numbers and taught Madison to use only in serious situations. Her tiny fingers dialed 911 with a determination that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Hello? I need to report medicine poisoning at Seattle Children's Hospital parking garage," Madison said into the phone, her voice clear and urgent despite her age. "A little boy is drinking bad medicine that's making him unable to walk, and I think someone's been lying to his daddy about what's wrong with him." Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. The parking garage seemed to spin slightly around him as he processed what this child was saying. Tyler, still clutching his juice box with both hands, looked between his father and the strange little girl with confusion clouding his young features. "Daddy, what's she talking about?" Tyler asked, his voice small and uncertain. The question carried the weight of a child who had learned to accept his limitations without question, who had never known a world where he could run and play like other children. Before Marcus could respond, before his mind could even begin to formulate a response to such an incomprehensible situation, Sarah stepped forward. Her nurse's training was kicking in, overriding her embarrassment about her daughter's behavior as she processed what Madison had just said. "Madison, what exactly did you see?" Sarah asked, crouching down to meet her daughter's eyes. Her voice carried the professional calm she used with frightened patience, but Madison could see the concern building in her mother's expression. "The blue medicine," Madison whispered, pointing at Tyler's juice box with a small finger that trembled slightly with excitement and fear. "I heard Dr. Stevens and Dr. Rodriguez talking about someone giving a little boy the wrong medicine to make his legs not work right. They said he could walk normal if he just stopped drinking the paralysis medicine." The color drained from Marcus's face as if someone had opened a valve and let all the blood flow out. For 3 years, ever since Tyler had been diagnosed with a rare muscular condition, he'd faithfully administered the prescribed liquid medication twice daily, morning and evening, like clockwork. The routine had become as natural as breathing. Wake up, help Tyler get dressed, give him his medicine with breakfast, drive him to his special school, pick him up in the afternoon, give him his evening dose with dinner, help him with his physical therapy exercises, and put him to bed. Every single day for 3 years without fail. "That's impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked the conviction he was trying to project. "Dr. Hamilton is one of the most respected pediatric specialists in the country. He's been treating Tyler since he was 2 years old." "Sir, I'm a nurse here," Sarah said quietly, her professional demeanor taking over completely as she stood and faced Marcus directly. "If my daughter overheard what she's describing, we need to take this seriously. Medical fraud and medication tampering are extremely serious crimes." In the distance, sirens began to wail, growing louder as they approached the hospital complex. Tyler looked up at his father with eyes that seemed older than his 5 years. "Daddy, what if she's right? What if my legs aren't really broken?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow to his chest, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his knees feel weak. For 3 years, he'd watched his son struggle with mobility, had spent countless hours researching treatments and experimental therapies, had donated millions of dollars to muscular dystrophy research hoping to find a cure. He'd rearranged his entire life around Tyler's condition, modified their home with ramps and special equipment, hired specialized caregivers, enrolled Tyler in schools equipped for children with mobility issues. The idea that it might all be unnecessary, that his son might have been deliberately kept disabled, was almost too devastating to contemplate. Madison looked between Tyler and his father, seeing the pain and confusion in both their faces. In her 6-year-old mind, the solution seemed obvious. "Tyler, can you try to wiggle your toes inside your shoes?" she asked gently. Tyler looked uncertain but curious. Slowly, carefully, he concentrated on his feet. To everyone's amazement, his toes moved visibly inside his small leather shoes. "They moved!" Tyler exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder. "Daddy, did you see? My toes moved!" Marcus knelt beside his son, his expensive suit forgotten as his knees hit the cold concrete. "Tyler, can you feel your legs right now?" "They feel tingly," Tyler said, his young face scrunched up in concentration. "Like when your foot falls asleep, but not as much." The sirens were getting closer now, and other families in the parking garage were beginning to stare at the unusual scene unfolding near the Mercedes. Officer Diana Rodriguez arrived at the scene within minutes, her police cruiser's lights casting blue and red shadows across the parking garage walls. The rotating emergency lights created an almost surreal atmosphere, making the expensive cars and concrete pillars look like something from a movie set. As a 12-year veteran of the Seattle Police Department, she'd responded to countless calls ranging from domestic disputes to armed robberies, but medical fraud involving a child wasn't something she encountered every day. Her experience had taught her to approach unusual situations with an open mind and careful attention to detail. "Who called 911? Officer Rodriguez asked, stepping out of her vehicle with the confident posture of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. She was a woman in her late 30s with short black hair and intelligent dark eyes that immediately assessed the scene before her. Madison raised her small hand, still gripping her flip phone like a lifeline. "I did. That little boy is being poisoned and nobody knows except the doctors who were talking in secret." Officer Rodriguez looked at the unusual group assembled near the black Mercedes. A well-dressed businessman, kneeling beside a small boy with crutches, a woman in nursing scrubs, and a determined-looking little girl, who had obviously been the source of the emergency call. Marcus Blackwell found himself in the surreal position of watching his perfectly ordered world unravel because of a 6-year-old girl's accusation. Everything logical in his mind screamed that this was impossible, yet something deep in his gut whispered that he should listen. His business instincts, honed by years of high-stakes negotiations, told him to take control of the situation immediately. But his father's heart was beginning to race with a possibility too terrifying and too hopeful to fully acknowledge. "Officer, this is clearly a misunderstanding," Marcus began, his CEO voice automatically asserting the kind of authority that usually ended conversations before they became problematic. "My son Tyler has a diagnosed medical condition that requires daily medication. We've been working with Dr. Charles Hamilton for 3 years. He's a respected specialist with an excellent reputation." Officer Rodriguez pulled out her notepad, but before she could speak, Sarah stepped forward with the confidence that came from years of advocating for patients and their families. "I work inside," Sarah said, gesturing toward the hospital entrance. "I'm a registered nurse in the pediatric wing, and I've been employed here for 8 years. If my daughter overheard physicians discussing medication tampering, we have a legal and ethical responsibility to investigate immediately." Tyler, still perched against his father's Mercedes, looked between the adults with growing confusion and curiosity. At 5 years old, he'd never known life without his crutches, never questioned why his legs felt heavy and unresponsive, never wondered what it might feel like to run or jump like the children he watched on television. But something in Madison's urgency, something in the way the adults were suddenly paying such serious attention to his medicine, sparked a curiosity he'd never felt before. "Daddy, what if she's right?" Tyler asked innocently, his young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What if my legs aren't really broken? What if I could play soccer like the kids on TV? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow, more devastating than any hostile takeover or corporate crisis he'd ever faced. For 3 years, he'd watched his son accept his limitations with the kind of grace that broke his heart daily. He'd seen Tyler watch other children play at parks, seen him try to keep up during family gatherings, seen the quiet sadness in his eyes when he couldn't participate in activities that other children took for granted. The idea that this suffering might have been artificially imposed was almost unbearable. Officer Rodriguez knelt down to Madison's eye level, recognizing that the little girl was the key witness in whatever was unfolding here. Her training had taught her that children often observed details that adults missed, and their lack of social filtering sometimes led them to report things exactly as they heard them. "Sweetheart, can you tell me exactly what you heard the doctors say? Try to remember their exact words if you can." Madison took a deep breath, the way her mother had taught her when she needed to be very careful and precise with her words. She closed her eyes for a moment, accessing the detailed memory that children often possess for conversations that capture their attention. Dr. Stevens was talking to Dr. Rodriguez, not you, a different Rodriguez who works inside, about a little boy who was getting paralysis medicine instead of vitamins. She said someone was switching his medicine on purpose and he could walk normal if they could figure out who was doing it. She said it wasn't an accident, and that someone with medical knowledge was doing it deliberately. "When exactly did you hear this conversation?" Officer Rodriguez asked, making careful notes. 3 days ago on Monday. I was coloring in the supply room near the pharmacy, while Mama was helping with an emergency in the ICU. There was a code blue, and all the nurses had to help. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed the timeline and realized she could verify Madison's account. 3 days ago, she remembered clearly. There had been a cardiac emergency involving a 7-year-old patient that had required all available staff for nearly 2 hours. She'd left Madison in what she thought was a safe, quiet space with her coloring books and a snack, never imagining that her daughter might overhear such a serious conversation. Marcus pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as the implications of what they were discussing began to sink in. "I'm calling Dr. Hamilton right now. This is ridiculous. There has to be a simple explanation." As Marcus dialed the number he'd called hundreds of times over the past 3 years, Tyler struggled to adjust his position against the car. For the first time in anyone's memory, he seemed to be moving his legs more freely, less dependent on his arms and crutches for support. Madison noticed the change immediately, her sharp eyes trained on Tyler with the intensity of a scientist observing an important experiment. "Look, Tyler, your legs moved differently that time." Everyone turned to watch as Tyler, seemingly unconsciously, repositioned both legs without the stiffness and resistance that had characterized his movements for 3 years. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who had been watching him carefully. "Tyler," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "when did you last take your medication?" Tyler looked at his father, who was now speaking tersely into his phone, then back at the police officer. "This morning with breakfast, right, Daddy? But I dropped my afternoon one in the parking lot when we got here." Marcus ended his call abruptly, his face pale and his expression troubled. "Doctor, Hamilton's office says he's unavailable and won't be able to return my call until next week. That's never happened before. In 3 years of treatment, he's always been available within hours." Officer Rodriguez made another note. "Mr. Blackwell, I think we need to contact the hospital administration immediately. If there's been deliberate medication tampering, this is a serious criminal matter that requires immediate investigation." Tyler, sensing the gravity of the conversation despite not understanding all the medical terminology, reached out and touched Madison's hand with the kind of instinctive trust that children sometimes show toward other children. "Are you saying I might be able to walk without these?" he asked, gesturing to his crutches with a mixture of hope and fear in his voice. Madison's 6-year-old heart broke at the vulnerability in his question. She thought about all the children she'd seen in the hospital, who desperately wanted to get better, and how sometimes the grown-ups couldn't figure out how to help them because they didn't have all the right information. "I think maybe the medicine has been making your legs sleepy for a really long time," Madison said gently, choosing words that a 5-year-old could understand. "Like when you go to the dentist and they give you medicine so your mouth feels funny, and you can't move your tongue right. except someone's been giving you the wrong kind that makes your legs feel that way. Marcus felt his knees weaken as the full implications hit him. 3 years of watching his son struggle. 3 years of accepting limitations that might have been artificially imposed. 3 years of trusting a medical professional who might have been deliberately harming his child. 3 years of modified bedrooms, special equipment, expensive schools, and careful planning around Tyler's mobility issues. 3 years of watching other families take simple things like playground visits and bike rides for granted, while his son watched from the sidelines. "We need to go inside immediately," Officer Rodriguez said firmly, her professional demeanor sharpening as she realized the scope of what they might be dealing with. "We need to speak with hospital administration, pharmacy staff, and we need to get this medication tested by the lab right away." As they began moving toward the hospital entrance, Tyler using his crutches while Madison walked beside him like a protective guardian, Marcus called his executive assistant with hands that trembled slightly. "Cancel everything for the next week," he said into his phone, his voice carrying a tone his assistant had never heard before, vulnerable, uncertain, almost broken. "Cancel the board meeting, the merger discussions, everything. And call Jonathan Myers. Tell him I need my attorney here immediately. Tell him it's more urgent than anything we've ever dealt with." But as they approached the hospital doors, Marcus realized with growing dread that lawyers and money might not be enough to fix what had been done to his family. If Madison was right, if his son had been deliberately kept disabled for 3 years, the betrayal went deeper than any business deal gone wrong or corporate crisis he'd ever faced. This was personal. This was about his child. And someone was going to pay for what they'd done. Tyler looked up at his father with eyes full of questions that Marcus couldn't yet answer. But underneath the confusion, there was something else. A spark of hope that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Daddy, if the medicine was wrong, does that mean I could learn to ride a bike? Could I run around the playground with other kids?" Marcus had to stop walking for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple hope in his son's voice and the crushing weight of what they might be about to discover. Behind them, Madison's small hand slipped into Tyler's free hand, and together they walked toward answers that would change everything. Hospital Administrator Helen Morrison had seen her share of crises during her 15 years at Seattle Children's Hospital, but the emergency meeting called at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening promised to be unlike anything in her experience. She'd dealt with malpractice suits, accreditation reviews, and even a scandal involving financial irregularities, but never an allegation of deliberate medication tampering against a child. The conference room felt smaller than usual with so many people crowded inside. Conference Room B was typically used for routine staff meetings, but tonight it had been transformed into the center of what could become a major criminal investigation. Marcus Blackwell sat rigidly in his chair, every line of his expensive suit perfect, despite the emotional turmoil of the past hour. Tyler sat beside him, his crutches leaning against the table, while Madison swung her legs from her seat next to her mother. Officer Rodriguez had her notepad ready, and Dr. Patricia Stevens, the same physician Madison had overheard 3 days earlier, looked pale and shaken as she reviewed Tyler's medical file with trembling hands. Dr. Stevens was a woman in her early 40s with dark curly hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been practicing pediatric medicine for nearly 2 decades, and the possibility that a child had been systematically poisoned under her watch was making her feel physically ill. "Mr. Blackwell," Administrator Morrison began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she'd learned from years of handling sensitive situations. "We take any allegation of medical misconduct extremely seriously. Dr. Stevens has been reviewing your son's case since Officer Rodriguez contacted us an hour ago, and what we've discovered is deeply troubling." Dr. Stevens cleared her throat, her voice tight with a combination of professional concern and personal guilt. "Marcus, I need to ask you some direct questions about Tyler's treatment history, and I need you to answer as precisely as possible." Marcus nodded, his businessman's composure barely masking the anxiety churning beneath the surface. He'd spent his entire adult life in control of every situation, but this felt like standing on shifting sand. "Who specifically prescribed Tyler's daily medication, and exactly how long has he been taking it?" "Dr. Charles Hamilton," Marcus replied immediately, the name rolling off his tongue with the familiarity of 3 years of trust. Tyler's been taking it twice daily for 3 years, since he was diagnosed with juvenile muscular dystrophy when he was 2 years old. Dr. Stevens and Administrator Morrison exchanged a look that made Marcus's stomach drop. Marcus, Dr. Stevens said gently, we've conducted a thorough review of our medical staff records, our consulting physician database, and our affiliated practices directory. Dr. Charles Hamilton hasn't had medical privileges at this hospital for over 4 years. He lost his medical license for insurance fraud and prescription drug trafficking. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, as if someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until he couldn't breathe. That's impossible. I've been taking Tyler to his office every month for 3 years. We have appointments scheduled through next year. I've paid thousands of dollars for consultations and treatments. Where exactly have you been taking your son for these appointments? Administrator Morrison asked, her fingers poised over her laptop keyboard. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through his meticulously organized calendar with hands that weren't quite steady. The Hamilton Medical Building on Pine Street, Suite 402. Dr. Hamilton's private practice. We're there every month like clockwork. Officer Rodriguez looked up from her notes with a grim expression. Mr. Blackwell, I'm going to need to verify this, but my preliminary check shows that building was converted to office condos 2 years ago. There's no medical practice operating there currently. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridors. The implications of what they were discovering seemed to hang in the air like a toxic cloud. Tyler, who had been playing quietly with a toy car that a nurse had given him, looked up at his father with growing confusion and a dawning awareness that something was very wrong. Daddy, if we weren't going to a real doctor, where were we going every month? Who was the man in the white coat who always talked to me? Marcus felt the room spinning around him as everything he'd believed about his son's care crumbled. I don't know, Tyler. I honestly don't know. Madison, who had been listening intently with the kind of focused attention that adults often underestimated in children, suddenly spoke up with a question that cut through the confusion like a laser. Mr. Tyler's daddy, do you have a brother? Marcus looked startled by the seemingly random question, his mind struggling to make connections. Yes, I have a brother named David, but he died 4 years ago in a car accident. Why would you ask that? Madison looked at her mother, then back at Marcus with the serious expression that children wear when they're about to share something important. Because when I heard the doctors talking in the supply room, they said the little boy's uncle was the one switching his medicine. They said he was pretending to be a doctor and that he had access to medical supplies because of his job. The color drained from Marcus's face as puzzle pieces began clicking into place with horrifying clarity. His brother David had worked in the medical field, or at least that's what Marcus had always believed. Dr. Stevens leaned forward across the conference table, her voice urgent. Marcus, this is critically important. Did your brother have access to medical supplies? Any connection to pharmaceutical distribution or hospital systems? Marcus's mind raced backward through memories he'd never questioned before. David worked at Northwest Medical Supply Company. He said he was a pharmaceutical sales representative. He was the one who helped me find Dr. Hamilton when Tyler was first diagnosed. He said Hamilton was the best specialist in the region for Tyler's specific condition. Administrator Morrison was typing rapidly on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed database after database. I'm pulling up all records associated with your brother's name, any medical licenses, pharmaceutical certifications, or hospital access credentials. As they waited for the search results, Tyler grew restless in his chair. He attempted to adjust his position, and for the first time in anyone's memory, his legs responded with a fluidity and strength that had been absent for 3 years. Madison noticed the change immediately, her sharp eyes trained on Tyler's movements with scientific precision. Look, Tyler, your legs are moving more normal now. Everyone turned to watch as Tyler, seemingly unconsciously, repositioned both legs without the stiffness, weakness, and trembling that had characterized his movements for as long as anyone could remember. The change was dramatic enough to be visible to everyone in the room. Tyler, Dr. Stevens said carefully, pulling her chair closer to the boy. When exactly did you last take your medication? I need you to think carefully about the timing. Tyler looked at his father, then at the concerned faces around the table. This morning with my cereal, right, Daddy? You gave it to me in the kitchen like always. But I was supposed to have another one this afternoon and I dropped it in the parking lot when we got out of the car. Dr. Stevens pulled out her phone and began calculating rapidly. It's been approximately 11 hours since your last dose. Tyler, I want you to try something for me. Can you try to stand up without using your crutches? Marcus started to object, his protective instincts flaring like an alarm system. Absolutely not. He could fall and hurt himself. He hasn't stood without support in 3 years. Dr. Stevens held up a gentle but firm hand. Marcus, we'll be right here to catch him if he falls. But if Madison is right about what she overheard, Tyler's muscle weakness may have been artificially induced. The medication may be wearing off. Tyler looked uncertain but excited, his young face bright with a possibility he'd never been allowed to consider. Can I try, Daddy? I want to see if my legs work. With everyone positioned around him like a safety net, Tyler slowly placed his feet flat on the floor and pushed himself up from the chair using only his arm strength. For a moment, he wobbled uncertainly, his small body adjusting to sensations he hadn't felt in years, and then miraculously he stood. He stood without assistance, without crutches, without support, for the first time in 3 years. The room erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations. Sarah Chen put her hand over her mouth in amazement. Officer Rodriguez stopped taking notes and simply stared. Dr. Stevens began crying quietly, overwhelmed by the implications of what they were witnessing. Tyler looked down at his legs in absolute amazement, his young mind struggling to process this new reality. Daddy, I'm standing. I'm really standing, Tyler exclaimed, his voice filled with pure joy and wonder. Then, taking a deep breath, Tyler took one tentative step forward, then another. His movements were shaky and uncertain, like someone learning to walk for the first time, but they were real steps powered by his own muscles. Madison clapped her hands together with delight. I knew it. I knew the medicine was making your legs sleepy. You can walk, Tyler. Marcus Blackwell, CEO of a billion-dollar company, a man who'd never shown weakness in a boardroom or corporate negotiation, broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as he watched his son take his first unassisted steps in years. But even as joy and relief filled the room, Officer Rodriguez was making rapid notes and Administrator Morrison was pulling up more information on her laptop. Dr. Stevens, if Tyler's uncle was impersonating a doctor and deliberately administering the wrong medication for 3 years, we're looking at multiple felony charges including aggravated assault, child endangerment, medical fraud, and criminal impersonation of a healthcare provider, Officer Rodriguez said grimly. But David is dead, Marcus insisted, his voice breaking with emotion. He died in a car accident 4 years ago. I went to his funeral. I helped plan his memorial service. Administrator Morrison looked up from her laptop, her expression grim and confused. Mr. Blackwell, this is very strange. I'm not finding any death certificate for a David Blackwell in Washington state records from 4 years ago. No accident reports, no obituaries, no burial permits. The celebration stopped abruptly, as the implications of her words sank in like stones dropping into still water. Madison, with the clarity that children sometimes possess in complex situations when adults become overwhelmed by emotion, asked the question everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. Mr. Tyler's daddy, what if your brother isn't really dead? What if he just wanted everyone to think he was dead, so he could keep giving Tyler the wrong medicine without anyone looking for him? As Tyler continued taking hesitant but increasingly steady steps around the conference room, testing his newfound mobility with the wonder of a child discovering the world anew, Marcus realized that everything he'd believed about his family, his brother, and his son's condition was about to be shattered forever. The truth he was beginning to understand was far more sinister and complex than anyone had imagined. And somewhere out there, the person responsible for 3 years of his son's unnecessary suffering was still free, still dangerous, and still unknown. The following morning brought a flurry of activity that transformed the quiet corridors of Seattle Children's Hospital into something resembling a crime scene investigation. Detective James Morrison, no relation to the hospital administrator, had taken over the case from Officer Rodriguez, bringing with him a team of specialists that included forensic accountants, pharmaceutical investigators, and computer forensics experts. Marcus had spent the night in a hotel room adjacent to the hospital, unable to bear the thought of taking Tyler home to an environment that now felt contaminated by deception. Tyler had slept peacefully for the first time in months, his body no longer fighting against artificial paralysis, while Marcus stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Madison and her mother had returned to their small apartment, but not before Madison had extracted a promise from Tyler that he would practice walking every day until he was strong enough to run. The bond between the two children had formed with the intensity that only shared crisis could create. Detective Morrison was a tall, lean man in his early 50s with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that came from years of investigating complex cases. He'd seen financial fraud, medical malpractice, and family betrayals, but the deliberate poisoning of a child by a family member was something that made even his experienced stomach turn. Mr. Blackwell, Detective Morrison began as they sat in the same conference room where Tyler had taken his first steps the night before. We've spent the night running background checks, financial records, and surveillance footage. What we've discovered is extremely disturbing. Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, Tyler beside him practicing small movements with his legs under the table. The boy's recovery was happening faster than anyone had expected, as if his young body was eager to reclaim 3 years of stolen mobility. Your brother David is very much alive, Detective Morrison continued, opening a thick file folder. We've traced financial records, surveillance footage from various locations, and employment records. He's been operating under multiple identities for the past 4 years. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. That's impossible. I saw his body. I identified him at the morgue. Detective Morrison pulled out a series of photographs and documents. The body you identified belonged to a homeless man named Robert Chen, who died in the car accident that your brother staged. David had been paying this man to use his appearance and identification for months leading up to the accident. The facial injuries from the crash made positive identification difficult. Sarah Chen, who had arrived early to check on Tyler's condition, gasped audibly at the mention of the surname. Chen, did you say Robert Chen? Detective Morrison looked at her with interest. Yes, ma'am, did you know him? Sarah's face had gone completely pale. Robert Chen was my husband, Madison's father. He disappeared 4 years ago and we never found his body. I thought he'd just left us. The room fell silent as everyone processed this new connection. Madison, who had been coloring quietly at the table, looked up at her mother with wide eyes. Mama, are you saying my daddy didn't leave us? Someone hurt him. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking together in ways that made everyone in the room feel sick. Detective Morrison looked between Sarah and Marcus with growing understanding. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you some specific questions about your husband's disappearance and any connection he might have had to David Blackwell. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for Madison. Robert worked as a maintenance supervisor at Northwest Medical Supply Company, the same company where Marcus's brother claimed to work. Robert had access to pharmaceutical storage areas, shipping manifests, and inventory records. Marcus felt the world spinning around him as more connections became clear. David used your husband's access to steal medications and forge prescriptions. That's exactly what we believe happened, Detective Morrison confirmed. But when Robert discovered what David was doing and threatened to report him, David staged the car accident to eliminate the witness and fake his own death simultaneously. Madison looked between her mother and Tyler's father with the kind of intuitive understanding that children sometimes possess in emotional situations. Tyler, does this mean my daddy tried to help you and that's why the bad man hurt him? Tyler reached across the table and took Madison's hand with the solemn seriousness of a 5-year-old making an important promise. If your daddy tried to help me, then he was a hero. And heroes don't really die, they just go away for a while. Dr. Stevens, who had been monitoring Tyler's condition throughout the night, entered the conference room with a clipboard full of test results. Tyler's blood work confirms everything we suspected, she announced. His system has been saturated with a cocktail of muscle relaxants and mild sedatives for years. The good news is that there appears to be no permanent damage. With proper physical therapy, he should regain full mobility within a few months. Marcus felt tears of relief mixing with his anger and grief. Doctor, how could this have gone undetected for so long? How could a child be systematically poisoned for 3 years without anyone noticing? Dr. Stevens sat down heavily, the weight of professional responsibility evident in her expression. Because the person doing this had medical knowledge and access to legitimate-looking prescriptions. The doses were carefully calibrated to mimic the symptoms of a real muscular condition. It was diabolical in its sophistication. Detective Morrison pulled out another set of documents. We've also discovered that David has been monitoring your family extensively. He's been living in a rented house less than 5 miles from your home, and he's been documenting Tyler's condition with photographs and video recordings. Why? Marcus asked, his voice breaking with emotion. Why would my own brother do this to my son? What could he possibly gain from keeping Tyler disabled? The detective's expression grew even more grim. Mr. Blackwell, we believe your brother was building a case for legal guardianship. If Tyler's condition had continued to deteriorate, and if something had happened to you, David could have petitioned for custody as the boy's closest relative. As Tyler's guardian, he would have had access to your son's substantial inheritance. Marcus felt his world collapse completely. His brother hadn't just been poisoning Tyler out of some twisted psychological motivation. He'd been systematically destroying a child's life for money. How much money are we talking about? Sarah asked quietly. Tyler is the primary beneficiary of a trust fund worth approximately $50 million, Marcus replied, his voice hollow. It becomes accessible when he turns 18, or earlier if I die and his guardian deems it necessary for his medical care. Madison had been listening to this conversation with the kind of intense focus that children bring to situations they sense are monumentally important. Suddenly she looked up from her coloring book with an expression of urgent concern. Tyler's daddy. Where's the bad uncle man right now? Is he still pretending to be a doctor? Detective Morrison's radio crackled to life before he could answer. The voice on the other end was urgent and filled with static. Detective Morrison, we've got movement at the Pine Street location. Subject appears to be destroying evidence, requesting immediate backup. Marcus bolted upright in his chair. That's the medical building. David is there right now? Everyone stay here, Detective Morrison ordered as he headed for the door. Mr. Blackwell, I need you to remain with your son. This situation could become dangerous. But as the detective rushed out, Tyler looked at his father with determination that was startling in a 5-year-old. Daddy, I want to see the bad man who hurt me. I want to look at him with my walking legs and tell him he didn't win. Marcus knelt beside his son, overwhelmed by the courage he saw in Tyler's young face. Tyler, that man is dangerous. He hurt you for 3 years. We need to let the police handle this. But Daddy, Tyler said, taking a few experimental steps around the conference room. I'm not scared anymore. He can't make my legs not work now that we know the truth. Madison stood up from her coloring and walked over to Tyler. Tyler, my mama says that sometimes the best way to beat bad people is to show them they couldn't break the good things inside you. As sirens wailed in the distance, heading toward the confrontation that would finally bring David Blackwell to justice, Tyler took his father's hand and spoke with wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. Daddy, can we go home now? I want to try running in our backyard. 3 hours later, Detective Morrison returned to the hospital with news that would close one chapter of the nightmare and open another. David Blackwell was in custody, arrested while attempting to destroy evidence in what had indeed been a sophisticated medical fraud operation, operating out of the former Hamilton Medical Building. We found everything, Detective Morrison announced as he rejoined the group in the conference room. Medical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies, forged prescription pads, and detailed records of Tyler's condition going back 3 years. Your brother had been documenting every aspect of Tyler's deterioration like some kind of twisted scientific experiment. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. What kind of records? Photographs, video recordings, medical charts tracking the effects of different drug combinations. He was treating your son like a laboratory subject. The detective's voice carried barely controlled anger. We also found evidence that he was planning to expand his operation to target other wealthy families with children. Tyler had been practicing walking around the conference room, growing stronger and more confident with each step. But now he stopped and looked at his father with concern. "Daddy, does this mean other kids were getting hurt like me?" "No, son," Detective Morrison said gently, kneeling down to Tyler's level. "You were the only one, and now that we've caught him, he'll never be able to hurt any children again." Sarah had been quiet during most of the discussion, processing the revelation that her missing husband had been murdered while trying to protect a child he'd never met. But now she looked up with a question that had been troubling her. "Detective Morrison, you said Robert was trying to stop David. Do you know exactly what happened the night he disappeared?" The detective nodded grimly. "Based on evidence we found in David's records and surveillance footage from the medical supply company, Robert had discovered discrepancies in pharmaceutical inventory and traced them to David's theft operation. He was planning to report David to federal authorities the next morning." Madison looked up from her coloring book, her 6-year-old mind processing this information with remarkable clarity. "So my daddy was trying to save Tyler before he even knew Tyler needed saving?" "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Your father was a hero who tried to do the right thing." Tyler walked over to Madison and sat down beside her. "Madison, your daddy saved me even though he never met me. That makes him the best kind of hero." As the children comforted each other with the kind of innocent wisdom that adults often lose, Marcus found himself looking at Sarah Chen with new understanding. Both of their lives had been shattered by David's greed and manipulation, but their children had found a way to heal together. "Mrs. Chen," Marcus said quietly, "I don't know how to begin to apologize for what my brother did to your family." Sarah looked at him with tired but kind eyes. "Mr. Blackwell, you're not responsible for your brother's actions, but maybe we can find a way to help each other move forward." Dr. Stevens had been quietly reviewing Tyler's latest test results, and now she looked up with a smile that had been absent from her face for the past 24 hours. "Tyler, I have some wonderful news. Your latest blood work shows that the medications are almost completely out of your system. Your muscle response tests are remarkable. I believe you'll be running and playing like any other 5-year-old within a few weeks." Tyler's face lit up with pure joy. "Really? I can really run and play soccer and ride a bike?" "All of that and more, Dr. Stevens confirmed. "You're going to need some physical therapy to rebuild the strength you've lost, but there's no reason you can't do everything other children your age can do." Madison clapped her hands together. "Tyler, this means you can come to my school and play on the playground with me." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with Tyler's medical recovery. Watching his son form a friendship with the little girl who had saved his life was healing something inside him that he hadn't even realized was broken. "Madison," Marcus said, crouching down to her level, "you saved my son's life. I don't know how to thank you for being so brave and speaking up when you knew something was wrong." Madison considered this seriously. "Tyler's daddy. I think sometimes kids notice things that grown-ups miss because we're not worried about being wrong. We just want to help." Detective Morrison was packing up his files when his phone rang. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a satisfied expression. That was the district attorney's office. "David Blackwell has been charged with first-degree murder in the death of Robert Chen, aggravated assault against a child, medical fraud, and about a dozen other felonies. He's going to be in prison for the rest of his life." Tyler looked up from where he was practicing standing on one foot. "Does this mean the bad man can never hurt anyone ever again?" "That's exactly what it means, Tyler." As the afternoon sun streamed through the conference room windows, Marcus made a decision that felt more right than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. "Mrs. Chen, Sarah," he began, "I want to establish a foundation in your husband's name. Robert Chen tried to protect children he'd never met, and I think we should honor that by helping other families who are facing medical crises." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in 4 years they were tears of something other than grief. "Robert would have loved that," she whispered. Tyler and Madison were now sitting together at the table, drawing pictures with the crayons Madison had brought. Tyler was drawing a stick figure family labeled, Tyler and Madison and our daddies, while Madison was carefully coloring a picture of two children holding hands. Tyler, Madison said seriously, do you think our daddies would have been friends if they'd met when they were both alive? Tyler considered this with the gravity that 5-year-olds bring to important questions. I think they're probably friends now, wherever daddies go when they're not here anymore. And I think they're happy that we're friends too. Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look over their children's heads, both thinking the same thing. Sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected places. As the day wound down and the immediate crisis resolved into the beginning of a long healing process, Marcus realized that while David's betrayal had stolen 3 years of Tyler's childhood, it had also brought them to this moment, to Madison and Sarah, to the discovery of Tyler's strength, and to the beginning of something that felt like an extended family, built on shared trauma and mutual support. Tyler, Marcus said, are you ready to go home and try running in our backyard? Tyler stood up from his chair, walked steadily across the room to his father, and hugged him tightly. I'm ready, Daddy. But can Madison come too? I want to show her how fast I can run now. 6 months later, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Tyler Blackwell ran across the playground at Madison's elementary school with the boundless energy of a healthy 5-year-old, his laughter mixing with the sounds of other children at recess. The crutches that had defined his early years were now a distant memory, replaced by scraped knees, grass stains, and the kind of joyful exhaustion that comes from a day spent playing outside. Marcus stood at the edge of the playground, watching his son climb monkey bars with the same intensity he'd once brought to board meetings. Beside him, Sarah Chen smiled as she watched Madison push Tyler on the swings, both children shrieking with delight as Tyler pumped his legs to go higher. The spring air carried the scent of blooming cherry blossoms, and the afternoon sunlight painted everything in golden hues that made the playground feel like a scene from a fairy tale. Hard to believe it's only been 6 months, Sarah said, adjusting her new hospital administrator badge. The Robert Chen Foundation had not only been established but had grown rapidly, providing support for families dealing with medical fraud and helping to train healthcare workers to recognize signs of medication tampering. What had started as a memorial had evolved into a nationwide network of advocates and medical professionals dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. Tyler's physical therapist says he's actually stronger than most children his age now, Marcus replied, his voice filled with a pride that went deeper than any corporate achievement he'd ever celebrated. All that effort he had to put into simple movements when he was fighting against the medication built up incredible core strength and determination. The foundation had become more than just a memorial to Robert Chen. It had become a beacon of hope for families facing similar crises. Marcus had stepped back from active management of Blackwell Industries to focus on the foundation's work, discovering that protecting children was far more fulfilling than any corporate acquisition had ever been. The boardroom victories that had once defined his success now seemed hollow, compared to the letters they received from families whose children had been saved by the foundation's intervention protocols. Tyler came running over, breathless and beaming, his cheeks flushed with exertion and happiness. Daddy! Madison and I figured out how to go across the monkey bars together. We hold hands and swing at the same time. Want to see? I absolutely want to see, Marcus said, kneeling down to Tyler's level and marveling at how solid and strong his son felt when he hugged him. But first, do you remember what today is? Do you remember? Tyler's face grew serious, the playground sounds fading into background noise as he processed the weight of the day ahead. It's the day we go to see the bad Uncle Man in jail. Marcus nodded, studying his son's expression carefully. Over the past 6 months, Tyler had shown remarkable resilience in processing the trauma of his early years. But this would be the first time he'd faced David since learning the full truth about what had been done to him. That's right. Detective Morrison says you don't have to go if you don't want to. You're very brave, but no one expects you to face someone who hurt you. It's completely your choice and there's no wrong decision. Tyler looked across the playground where Madison was waiting for him by the monkey bars, her long blonde hair catching the sunlight as she waved at him encouragingly. Over the past 6 months, the two children had become inseparable, their friendship forged in crisis and strengthened by shared understanding of loss, recovery, and the kind of deep bond that forms between people who have saved each other's lives. "I want to go," Tyler said firmly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even Marcus. Madison said that sometimes the best way to stop being scared of someone is to look at them when you're strong and tell them they didn't win. She said her daddy would want me to be brave, and I want to show Uncle David that I'm not the sick little boy he tried to keep me being. Madison had indeed said that, with the kind of wisdom that 6-year-olds sometimes possess about emotional healing. She had also insisted on accompanying Tyler to the prison visit, declaring that friends stick together when things are hard, and Tyler shouldn't have to face the mean man alone. The drive to the Washington State Penitentiary took them through the heart of Seattle, past the hospital where their lives had intersected, past the memorial garden where Robert Chen was honored, past the foundation offices where Sarah now worked as executive director. Tyler and Madison sat in the back seat, holding hands and playing quiet word games that helped keep their nervousness at bay. 3 hours later, they sat in the visitor's room at the Washington State Penitentiary, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and the kind of institutional furniture that reminded everyone present that this was a place of punishment and confinement. David Blackwell looked older, thinner and smaller than Marcus remembered, as if the weight of his crimes had physically diminished him. The orange prison uniform was a far cry from the expensive suits and fake medical coats he'd worn during his years of deception. Tyler sat between Marcus and Madison, his small hands clasped in his lap but his back straight and his eyes clear. He'd grown 3 inches in 6 months of proper nutrition and natural physical development, and the haunted look that had shadowed his young face for years was completely gone, replaced by the bright confidence of a child who knew he was loved and protected. David looked across the table at his nephew with an expression that might have been remorse, though Marcus suspected it was more likely self-pity mixed with shock at seeing Tyler's transformation. The contrast between the vibrant, healthy child before him and the weak, dependent boy he'd spent 3 years manipulating must have been stark. "Tyler," David said quietly, his voice hoarse from months of limited conversation, "I want you to know that I never meant for things to go as far as they did. I never wanted to hurt you permanently." Tyler looked at his uncle for a long moment, processing the words with the kind of careful consideration that adults often rush through. Madison squeezed his hand supportively, lending him strength for what they all knew would be a difficult conversation. "Uncle David," Tyler said, his voice clear and steady despite his age, "you made my legs not work for 3 years. You made me think I was broken when I wasn't. You hurt Madison's daddy because he tried to help me, and you made Madison not have a daddy anymore." David's face crumpled slightly as the full weight of his actions was laid out by a 5-year-old who had every right to hate him, but spoke with matter-of-fact clarity instead. "I'm sorry, Tyler, I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that I regret everything I did." Tyler stood up from his chair, an action that 6 months ago would have been impossible without assistance, and looked directly at his uncle with the kind of steady gaze that conveyed both forgiveness and strength. "I forgive you because Daddy says forgiving people helps us feel better inside, not them. But I want you to know that you didn't break me. You thought you could make me weak forever, but you were wrong. I can run now, and jump, and climb trees, and I'm going to learn to ride a bike next week. Madison is teaching me." Madison stood beside Tyler, her small hand slipping into his in a gesture of solidarity that had become natural between them over the months of shared healing. "And Tyler has a best friend now," Madison added, her 6-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. "My daddy would be proud that something good came from the bad thing you did. Tyler and I are going to help other kids who get hurt by mean grown-ups just like my daddy tried to help Tyler." David began to cry, the reality of his nephew's strength and resilience hitting him harder than any legal punishment could have. But Tyler had already turned away, his business with his uncle completed. The confrontation he'd needed to have was over, and he was ready to leave this place and this person behind forever. As they walked out of the prison, Tyler looked up at his father with the kind of relieved expression that comes after completing a difficult but necessary task. "Daddy, can we go home now? Can we go? Madison's mom is making spaghetti for dinner and she said I could help stir the sauce. And tomorrow is Saturday so we can practice bike riding in the park all morning." Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with love and pride for his son's courage. Family dinners with Sarah and Madison had become a regular tradition. and weekends spent in parks and playgrounds had replaced the medical appointments and therapy sessions that had once defined their calendar. The four of them had created something that looked different from a traditional family, but felt more solid and loving than anything Marcus had ever experienced. "Of course we can go home," Marcus said, lifting Tyler onto his shoulders and feeling the solid weight of his healthy, strong son. "But first, Madison wanted to show you something special." Madison led them to a small memorial garden that had been planted behind the hospital with donations from the Robert Chen Foundation. The garden had grown over the months, with contributions from families whose children had been helped by the foundation's work. A simple stone bench sat surrounded by flowers, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Robert Chen, who protected children he never met, and taught us that heroes come in all forms." Additional smaller plaques had been added, honoring other healthcare workers and ordinary citizens who had spoken up to protect children in danger. The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for families dealing with medical trauma, a peaceful space where healing could begin. Tyler climbed down from his father's shoulders and approached the memorial with the kind of reverence that children show toward things they understand are important. He'd visited the garden many times over the past months, and each visit had helped him process the complex emotions surrounding his recovery and Madison's loss. "Mr. Madison's daddy," Tyler said to the memorial stone, his young voice carrying surprising maturity. "Thank you for trying to save me even though you never got to meet me. I'm going to be brave like you were, and I'm going to take care of Madison like you would have wanted. And when I grow up, I'm going to help protect other kids too." Madison sat on the bench and patted the space beside her, a ritual they'd developed during their many visits to the garden. "Tyler, I think my daddy would want us to remember that the best way to honor people who try to help others is to help people ourselves. That's why we're going to work for the foundation when we grow up." As they sat together in the memorial garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look that carried the weight of everything they'd been through and the hope of everything they were building together. Their relationship had evolved slowly and naturally, built on shared trauma, mutual respect, and the deep bond that came from watching their children heal each other. Tyler and Madison were already making plans for their next adventure: a bike riding lesson in the park, a trip to the science museum where Tyler wanted to learn about how muscles work, a sleepover where they could stay up late and tell stories about what they wanted to be when they grew up. The future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility, no longer shadowed by deception or artificial limitations. "Madison," Tyler said suddenly, "do you think when we're grown-ups, we'll still be best friends?" Madison considered this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to questions about the future. "I think we'll always be family even when we're old like our parents, because we helped save each other and that makes us connected forever." Marcus realized that while David's betrayal had stolen 3 years of Tyler's childhood, it had also led them to this moment, to Madison and Sarah, to the foundation that was helping other families, to the discovery of Tyler's incredible resilience, and to a definition of family that was bigger and stronger than blood alone. The foundation had already helped identify and stop 2 other cases of medical fraud against children, and their training programs were being implemented in hospitals across the country. What had started as one child's courage to speak up had become a movement to protect vulnerable children everywhere. As they walked back to their cars, Tyler suddenly stopped and looked back at the memorial garden, where solar lights were beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. "Daddy, do you think Madison's daddy knows that Tyler and Madison are best friends now? Do you think he knows we're helping other kids like he tried to help me?" Marcus followed his son's gaze to the peaceful garden where flowers were beginning to bloom in the spring air, where families came to find hope in the midst of crisis. "I think he knows, Tyler, and I think he's very happy about it. I think he's proud of both of you for being so brave and caring about other people." Tyler nodded solemnly, then brightened as he remembered something important. "Madison, race you to the car. I bet I can run faster now than you can." "You're on," Madison called back, taking off across the parking lot with Tyler close behind. And with that, the 2 children took off running, their laughter echoing across the parking lot as they chased each other toward home, toward family, toward a future that was finally, truly, theirs to claim. Behind them, Marcus and Sarah walked more slowly, hands linked, watching their children run with the kind of freedom and joy that had once seemed impossible. The end of their story was really just the beginning of everything good that would follow. Tomorrow would bring bike riding lessons and playground adventures. Next week would bring the Foundation's annual fundraising gala, where Tyler and Madison would speak to hundreds of people about the importance of protecting children. Next month would bring Sarah and Marcus's wedding, a celebration not just of their love but of the family they'd built from tragedy and hope. But tonight, they would go home together, all four of them, to a house filled with laughter and the kind of unconditional love that makes any place feel like home. Tonight, Tyler would help stir the spaghetti sauce while Madison set the table, and they would share stories about their day and make plans for tomorrow. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, the memory of Robert Chen's sacrifice would continue to inspire new heroes to step forward and protect the children who needed them most.